Welcome back, Bob. That boy had heart surgery. That boy had heart surgery a month ago. It's Memorial Day weekend, and we begin by reading responsively at number 583, Archibald MacLeish's The Young Dead Soldiers. The young dead soldiers do not speak. Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They have a silence that speaks for them at night, and when the clock counts, they say, "We were young, we have died, remember us." They say, "We have done what we could, but until it is finished, it is not done." They say, "We have given our lives, but until it is finished, no one can know what our lives gave." They say, "Our deaths are not ours, they are yours. They will mean what you make them." They say, "Whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope, or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this." They say, "We leave you our deaths, give them their meaning." We were young, they say. We have died, remember us. Come, thou fount of every blessing. Our first hymn is number 126. and we join in the words of our unison affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth and love, and to help one another. So be it.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to First Parish in Bedford. First Parish is a community that welcomes friends and neighbors and is always welcoming newcomers and new members. We have a very large religious education program that we're very proud of, and an active bunch of teenagers doing good work around the community. There's always something new happening here, and lots of different ways to join in the fun. If you'd like to keep in touch with us, you can fill out a blue card found in the back of the pew in front of you. And please join us after the service for the coffee hour in the common room behind me. We are a Unitarian Universalist community, meaning that we believe people of all religions can be united by a common purpose of working together for the greater good. We believe that all people have the right to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and we champion rights and exciting things like diversity, creativity, and justice. There are some announcements in your order of service that I would like to draw your attention to. On Sunday, June 1st, we will be holding our annual Wisdom Tea in the Common Room. This event is to honor our longtime church members and the elders in our community. Mark your calendar and don't miss the reminiscing, laughter, and fellowship. On Tuesday from 7 to 9 p.m., I'm going to be leading the fourth of a series of adult ed classes on oral history, and I would love to have you join us if you're interested in telling stories. And finally, I have an announcement from Rich Doherty about the pledge drive. We have 80,000 left to go, and we spend more time on the last 20% than on the first 80%. And Rich would like everyone to know that it is like pulling cockleburs out of sheep's wool, which I have done, and it's very difficult. And now, a time for all ages.
Well, it is Memorial Day weekend, and I thought I'd reminisce a bit about Memorial Day traditions, and maybe you have some of your own traditions. But when I was growing up in Illinois on Memorial Day, my mother and father and I would pack the car up with a picnic basket, and we'd put geraniums in the trunk of the car and trowels, and we'd go off to the country to a small town called Sandwich, Illinois, where my great-great-grandfather had helped to found not only the Sandwich Fair, but also the Sandwich Cemetery. And we would go to the cemetery, and there would be something of a family reunion. There would be, it seemed to me, several 100-year-old aunts and various relatives that I saw only once a year. And we would trim the overgrown grass around the family cemetery plot, and the kids would run around. There was a Civil War cannon, and it was a lot of fun to climb up on that Civil War cannon. And we'd plant the geraniums and make sure that everything looked pretty tidy. And you know, the tradition is for the flag to stay at half staff until noon, and then the flag is raised up to the top. And so when we were done in the cemetery, we went off to some picnic grove someplace, and the 100-year-old aunts would all bring out their wicker baskets And everybody seemed to have the same kind of wicker picnic basket and would pull out deviled eggs and sandwiches and who knows what else. And once again, the kids would run amok. And my cousin Kathy was notorious for always stripping down to her underwear and jumping in the river. And the fun of this was watching Kathy's mother get furious. This was an annual Memorial Day tradition. And of course, I would go jump in the river as well, and we would have a grand old time. And then on the radio in the car as we would come home, we would probably be listening to the Indianapolis 500 on the radio, and you'd wonder if there was going to be a crash, and sometimes there was. And that's pretty much what Memorial Day was about. But let's just see here, what other kinds of traditions do you recall? Are there traditions in your families that you recall? Peggy, let me just bring the microphone over to you.
I grew up in a small village called Springville, which is about 30 miles south of Buffalo, and I was the youngest, and my sisters always played in the band, so we always went to the parade, and I got to see them marching down, and we would end up in front of the grade school where there was a memorial to the World War II veterans.
I should say that another piece of being in the cemetery was looking at all the gravestones. You'd go and you'd look at the gravestones and try to remember, who was this? That was somebody's brother or cousin, and oh, there was an unmarked grave, and oh, it was a baby that had died sometime. And you'd spend a whole lot of time looking at all the gravestones and wondering about the names. Did I see your hand up, Don?
We lived for several years in Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, and I'm not sure it's correct or not, but we were told at the time that that was the original birthplace of the Memorial Day celebration. I don't remember much of anything at all going on Memorial Day while we were there.
I grew up in central Connecticut in a little boondock town of East Windsor, and during Memorial Days that I remember, it wasn't family activities so much as the Memorial Day parade and things like that. And there were two elements that I recall, and one is that you waited until taps was going to be played, and you wondered whether the person playing it was going to miss his notes and sound kind of funny or not, and if it came off nicely, that was great, or even if it came out funny, that was okay too. The second thing is that I once had the honor as a Boy Scout walking in the parade to present from memory the Gettysburg Address on Memorial Day.
You remind me, when I was a minister in central Massachusetts, there would be Memorial Day observations, and there would perhaps be somebody who could recite In Flanders Field, another one, and you'd put your poppies on as well. You know, for kids, this is what it means on Memorial Day. You get to listen to 100-year-old people tell stories. And you know, this is part of the deal here. Did I see a hand here?
I grew up in the Midwest too, but this is a more recent memory. Our daughter, Hannah, is married to a Purple Heart Marine who served in Quezon. And any talk of war just absolutely enrages him. He would just as soon put the whole event in the past. And one time I asked whether he had, these bad dreams that veterans are supposed to have, and he said, yes, he did. And I said, well, what do you do when those come about? And he said, I go outside and I pound rocks. So luckily they have a lot of rocks to pound in Arizona. But as far as my memory of them is trying to remember not to bring up any mention of war or politics. And that is a very difficult memory to keep in mind.
Well, we're just going to do a couple more of these and then we'll move on.
So I grew up in Paramus, New Jersey, and we had a Memorial Day parade, and I marched in it as a Brownie and a Girl Scout, and the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts marched, and the veterans marched. And I remember the poppies because we wore poppies. And the other thing I remember was in our family, my father preferred Memorial Day and really didn't like 4th of July because the fireworks just brought back too many memories.
Hi, I grew up in Burlington, and I remember marching in the marching band and going to the cemetery, and I remember people fainting because of having the heavy uniforms on, marching band uniforms. I'm concerned about somebody doing that tomorrow because I heard it's going to be hot.
And one more.
I was telling John before the service that I have a dilemma because my birthday is May 30th, which is Memorial Day, not tomorrow. And I grew up when there were parades. I marched in the parades with the high school band. The town I grew up in, Somerville, New Jersey, hosted the Pop Kugler Memorial 50-mile bike race, which later became part of the national circuit and is still going on today. And so when the law was passed to change Memorial Day to the Monday closest to the 30th, I really got pissed because nobody celebrates my birthday regularly. They do it on some other day.
Okay, and how many of you, of course, remember when Memorial Day was Decoration Day? Decoration Day. We'd go and we'd decorate the graves. All right, kids and teachers are going to go off to their classes, and while they do, we are going to sing Spirit of Life. It's number 123 in the hymnal.
Good morning. My name is Bob Batt, and I'm a member of the lay pastoral visitors here at First Parish. I wish you all a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and hope all of you who are able to enjoy it with family and friends. I invite those who would like to share a joy or concern to come forward at this time. Please try and focus your thoughts and be brief. I will be here at the candle stand after the service for those who would like to light a silent candle. And I light a final candle for those of us who keep our thoughts and our joys and our concerns in our hearts.
In place of a sermon today, I will be reading a chapter from Wendell Berry's novel, Hannah Coulter. And you may remember me referring to Wendell Berry at various times. He is an environmentalist, he is a humanist, he is a farmer, he is an environmentalist, I said, and a remarkable writer of poetry, of essays, and of novels. Hannah Coulter is one of 9 novels that revolve around what he calls the Port William membership, a place in Kentucky, and one is introduced to a great variety of people in the Port William novels. And I'll read what it says on the back of Hannah Coulter. It says, in this latest installment of Wendell Berry's acclaimed story about the citizens of Port William, Kentucky, Hannah Coulter sorts through her memories. Twice widowed, alone, and in her late 70s, Hannah recalls childhood, young love and loss, raising children, and the changing of seasons. She offers her steady voice as she contemplates the deterioration of community with wise and often fiery opinions about the way things were, are, and might have been. Hannah Coulter was twice married. Her first husband was Virgil Feltner, and Virgil died in the Second World War, somewhere around the time of the Battle of the Bulge. Hannah was pregnant at the time and gave birth soon after Virgil had died. And then she remarried, and she married a man named Nathan Coulter, and they had a long and, for the very most part, happy marriage. And Nathan also was in the war and survived. He was at Okinawa, and the chapter I am going to read is about Okinawa. This is what Hannah says at the beginning of the novel. Nathan was anyway a quiet man who never had much extra to say. He had stories enough about Burley and Big Ellis and Toll Proudfoot and others, mostly funny, but about himself, about the coming of the war and his time in it, though he would say something occasionally, not much, not often, he told no stories. If the subject came up, he was apt to say, "Ignorant boys killing each other," or something else about that short. And then, looking away, he would shake his head and say no more. Over the years, I heard him say enough to know he didn't like the power of some people to say whether other people will live or die. He didn't like the idea of killing women and old men and children, or of destroying the world in order to kill people, or of great machines made only to kill people. What he did and what happened to him in the war, I don't know. While he was alive, I couldn't ask him. After he was dead, I learned what I could, and more than I could easily bear to know, about the Battle of Okinawa, where he fought. Okinawa, you know, is about 300 miles off the coast of Japan, and it was envisioned as a possible staging area were an invasion of Japan to be necessary. The battle there began on April 1st, which was both April Fool's Day and Easter Sunday, 1945. And the battle lasted for some 80 days and didn't end until well into June. And in the course of that very fierce battle, nearly 250,000 people were killed. We'll sing. Our hymn is Abide With Me, 101. Wendell Berry has also said, "To love anything good, no matter what the price, is a bargain. To love anything good, no matter what the price, is a bargain. Freely we have received, freely give. For the work of this church within and far, far beyond these walls, our offering will now gratefully be received."
Okay.
and the bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after. Tomorrow, when this world is free. The shepherds will tend their sheep. The valley will bloom again. Johnny will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. Johnny will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, when this world is free.
Okinawa. I married the war twice, as you might say, once in ignorance, once in knowledge. And yet I knew of it only what we suffered of it at home and what I read of it in the newspaper at the time. And later the little I sometimes saw of it on television. But of the actual experience of actual people in the war, I knew little. Of what Nathan had actually known and done and suffered in the fighting on Okinawa, I knew nothing. That is maybe not so hard to understand. Our life from the day we married until Nathan died was like a stretched strand. We had our obligations to meet and our work to do. The tasks overlapped and kept on. Before the work of 1 year had ended, the work of the next year began. I don't think Nathan himself dwelled more on the war than he had to, but I think he had to dwell on it. I think he saw the war as, in a way, the circumstance of the rest of his life. I know he dreamed about it. I know he did not talk about it. He did not talk about it, I understood, because it was painful to remember, and for the same reason I did not ask him about it. Now that I have taken the pains to learn something about it, I had better ask if I really wanted to know. I did. I needed to know, but I am not glad to know. I learned enough to know why I didn't learn it any sooner. Nathan was not the only one who was in it, who survived it and came home from it and did not talk about it. There were several from Port William who went and fought and came home and lived to be old men here, whose memories contained in silence the farthest distances of the world terrible sights, terrible sufferings. Some of them were heroes, and they said not a word. They stood among us like monuments without inscriptions. They said nothing or said little because we have barely a language for what they knew, and they could not bear the pain of talking of their knowledge in even so poor a language as we have. They knew the torment of the whole world at war, that nobody could make or end or escape alone, in which everybody suffered alone. As many who have known it have said of it, war is hell. It is the outer darkness beyond the reach of love, where people who do not know one another kill one another, and there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, where nothing is allowed to be real enough to be spared. Hell is a shameful place, and it is hard to speak of what you know of it. It is hard to live in Port William and yet have in mind the blasted and burnt, bloodied and muddy and stinking battlegrounds of Okinawa. Hard to live in one place and imagine another. It is hard to live one life and imagine another. But imagination is what is needed. Want of imagination makes things unreal enough to be destroyed. By imagination, I mean knowledge and love. I mean compassion. People of power kill children. The old send the young to die because they have no imagination. They have power. Can you have power and imagination at the same time? Can you kill people you don't know and have compassion for them at the same time? I was changed by Nathan's death because I had to be. Our life together here was over. It was my life alone that had to go on. The strand had slackened. I had begun the half a life you have when you have a whole life that you can only remember. I began this practice of sitting sometimes long hours into the night telling over this story, this life, that even when it was only mine was wholly Nathan's, and mine because for the term of this world we were wholly each other's. We were each other's chance to live in the room of love where we could be known well enough to be spared. We were each other's gift. But in my telling, I pretty soon had to reckon with Nathan's silence about the war. Out of all I knew of him came this need to know what he had known that I did not know. I went to the library and found books. I found some imperfect and false books, some picture books, for instance, that showed only the enemy dead. And I found some that were true, terrible for being true, brave enough to be terrible enough to be true. I didn't find out what happened to Nathan himself, of course, for what he knew will not be known again. I found out the sort of thing you would have known if you were a soldier and were there on Okinawa in the spring of 1945, when Easter and the beginning of battle both came on April Fool's Day. You went from an ordinary day in the ordinary world into the world of war, an exploding world where you lived inescapably, hour after hour, day after day, killing as you were bidden to do, suffering as you were bidden to do, dying as you were bidden to do. You were there to kill until you were killed, and this would finally seem to be the only world there was. It was a world where no place was safe, where you or your friends could be killed in any place at any minute. You were living, it seemed, inside a dark cloud filled with lightning and thunder, thousands of tons of explosives, bombs and shells, machine gun and rifle fire. The air was full of death. In some units, sooner or later, everybody was hit. You see a friend, shot and dying, lying in the dirt. A medical corpsman is kneeling beside him, tenderly touching his face, making the sign of the cross over him, weeping. Mortar shells are coming in as you open a can of food and try to eat. The friend beside you is hit, his head blown off. His brains spatter your clothes and your food. You start to vomit, and you cannot stop. You are standing beside your friend. A shell comes in and explodes. Your friend, knocked down, attempts to leap up and discovers that he has no legs. He dies. You cannot forget this. You have killed your enemy. You have seen his face as he died, the face of a living young man dying. You cannot forget this. Compassion makes the suffering worse. In the world of war, everything makes everything worse. Death falls from the sky. It flies in the air. The ground fills with the dead. The rain falls day after day. Mud makes everything worse. It is harder to bring up supplies, harder to move, harder to bring out the wounded and to bury the dead. Under fire, you attempt to dig a foxhole, and you dig right into the body of a man, rotten and full of maggots. The dead are blasted out of their graves. If you slip on a muddy slope and fall, you get up covered with maggots. They are on your clothes, on your skin, in your pockets. Flies are everywhere. Recalling the words of politicians about gallantry and sacrifice, one survivor said, "Only the flies benefited." The flies spread dysentery. You are wet, muddy, soiled with your own shit, and you live day after day, night after night, in the same clothes. The battlefield stinks of rotting flesh, excrement, vomit, the smoke of explosives, and of everything that will burn. Because of the stench and the noise and the never-ending fear, your rations, which are never appetizing, become harder and harder to eat. You are exhausted, and you cannot rest. As the weeks go by, you lose weight, maybe 20 pounds. You know from looking at your friends that you no longer look like yourself. It goes on without mercy, the fear unending, worst at night. At night, the quiet sounds worry you most. At night, you never know the origin of the quiet sounds. Is it a friend or an enemy? Are you hearing things? Are you losing your mind? You have to make up your mind that you will not lose your mind. You find where the enemy buried one of theirs, leaving a green branch on his canteen on his grave. Compassion makes it worse. You performed the cruelties that were required and sometimes cruelties that were not, and what would your folks have thought? You fought for days without knowing where you were, when the known world consisted of what you could see, the few friends fighting on either side of you, and the unknown enemy in front. You were lost in an enormous fact. The ones of you who were lost in it may never quite have found your way out of it, and nobody outside of it would ever quite understand it. How far were you from home? How far beyond the political slogans? You were one of an army of young men fighting to stay alive, and you were fighting in an army of young men who finally were fighting only to die. They had to be killed, almost every one of them. You knew the terrible loneliness of the thought that your life was worth nothing. You were expendable. You were being spent. Your folks could not have imagined what you were going through. You could not want them to know. You would never tell them. What saved it from utter meaninglessness and madness and ruin was the love between you and your friends fighting beside you. For them, you did what you had to do to try to stay alive, to try to keep them alive. For them, you did heroic acts that you did not know were heroic. What saved it were the medical corpsmen and stretcher bearers who went out again and again into the fields of fire to bring away the wounded, who brought something angelic into that hell of misery and hurt and destruction and death. What saved it was the enormous pity that seemed to accumulate in the air over it. To read of that battle when you love a man who was in it, that is hard going. I read in wonder, believing and sickened. I read weeping, because I didn't know exactly what had happened to Nathan. It all seemed to have happened to him. You can't give yourself over to love for somebody without giving yourself over to suffering. You can't give yourself to love for a soldier without giving yourself to his suffering in war. It is this body of our suffering that Christ was born into, to suffer it himself and to fill it with light, so that beyond the suffering we can imagine Easter morning and the peace of God on little earthly homelands such as Port William and the farming villages of Okinawa. But Christ's living unto death in this body of our suffering did not end the suffering. He asked us to end it, but we have not ended it. We suffer the old suffering over and over again. Eventually, in loving, you see that you have given yourself over to the knowledge of suffering in a state of war that is always going on. And you awake in the night to the thought of the hurt and the helpless, the scorned and the cheated, the burnt, the bombed, the shot, the imprisoned, the beaten, the tortured, the maimed, the spit upon, the shit upon. The Battle of Okinawa was not a battle only of two armies making war against each other. It was a battle of both armies making war against a place and its people. Before that spring, Okinawa had been a place of ancient country villages and farming landscapes of little fields, perfectly cultivated. The people were poor by our standards now, but peaceable and courteous, hospitable and kind. They hated violence and had no weapons. They made music and sang when they rested from their work in the fields. It was a land of song and dance. The people made beautiful things with their hands, buildings and gardens, weaving and pottery. They had survived conquest, poverty, storms and droughts, disease and hunger, but they had met no calamity like the Battle of 1945. It killed 150,000 of them as the fighting drove them out of their homes and they wandered with their children and old people into the fields of fire. They were killed by mistake. Nobody intended to kill them. They were just in the wrong place. It was their own place, but the war had made it wrong. And their beloved, lovely island was scoured and burned. Everything standing was destroyed. Houses, trees, gardens, tombs, towns, the capital city of Naha, the beautiful castle of Shuri. I found books with photographs of beautiful buildings, walls and gates, bridges and gardens, all destroyed in 1945. I found a photograph of some tanks driving across little fields, leaving deep tracks. I began to imagine something I know I cannot actually imagine. A human storm of explosions and quakes and fire, a man-made natural disaster gathering itself up over a long time out of ignorance and hatred, greed and pride, selfishness and a silly love of power. I imagined it gathering up into armies of ignorant boys killing each other and passing like a wind-driven fire over the quiet land and kind people. I knew then what Nathan knew all his life. It can happen anywhere. Like any storm, it finally ended. Like any fire, it burnt itself out. Like all the living, those doomed to die finally were dead. I imagined the quiet coming again over the burnt and blasted land. I imagined a green slope somewhere undestroyed, where a fresh, untainted breeze blew in from the sea. I imagined Nathan coming there alone and sitting down, facing home, knowing that he had lived and would live, the quiet coming over him, rest coming to him. And I imagined Port William, the town, the farmsteads, the fields and the woods, the river valley and the long, slow river taking shape again in his mind. And so I came to know, as I had not known before, what this place of ours had been and meant to him. I knew, as I had not known before, what I had meant to him. Our life in our place had been a benediction to him, but he had seen it always within a circle of fire that might have closed upon it. He was a rock to me but now I knew that he had been shaken. Okinawa shook him, and he was shaken for life, and deep in the night, he needed to touch me. I didn't know the reason then, but now I know that some old nightmare of the war had come back to him and frightened him awake. And ever so quietly, ever so gently, so as not to wake me, he would touch me. I would pretend to sleep on so as not to disturb him with the thought that he had wakened me. It was not a lover's touch. As I knew partly then, but know completely now, he needed to know that he was here and I was here with him, that he had come from the world of war again to this. Reassured, he would sleep again, and I too would sleep. Now I remember. Now I seem to dream again, that sleep of ours, helpless and dark, precious and brief, somehow allowed within the encircling fire. It can happen anywhere. This moment now, somehow allowed within the encircling fire.
The warm and lovely world we knew has been struck by a bitter frost. But my sister and I recall with a sigh the world we knew and loved and lost. My sister and I remember still a tulip garden by an old Dutch mill, and the home that was all our own until. But we don't talk about that. My sister and I recall once more the fishing schooners pulling into shore, and the dog cart we drove in days before. But we don't talk about that. We're learning to forget the fear that came from a troubled sky. We're almost happy over here, but sometimes we wake at night and cry. My sister and I recall the day we said goodbye and then we sailed away, and we think of our friends who had to stay. But we don't talk about that. We're learning to forget the fear that came from a troubled sky. We're almost happy over here, but sometimes we wake at night and cry. My sister and I recall the day we said goodbye, and then we sailed away, and we think of our friends who had to stay. But we don't talk about that.
This Is My Song. Our last hymn is number 159. Let us together say our closing words. The living can't quit living because the world has turned terrible and people they love and need are killed. They can't because they don't. The light that shines into darkness and never goes out calls them on into life. It calls them back again into the great room. It calls them into their bodies and into the world, into whatever the world will require. It calls them into work and pleasure, goodness and beauty, and the company of other loved ones. So be it. Call us back to life.
tuxedo press. I gotta sew a button on my vest, 'cause tonight I gotta look my best. Lulu's back in town. I gotta find a half a block somewhere. I gotta try my my shoes and slick my hair. Gotta get myself a boutonniere, 'cause Lulu's back in town. You can tell all my pets, all my blondes and brunettes, Mr. Otis regrets he won't be around. You can tell the mailman not to call, 'cause I ain't coming home until the fall, and I might not get back home at all. Lulu's back in town. Gotta get my old tuxedo pressed, gotta sew a button on my vest, 'cause tonight I gotta look my best. Lulu's back in town. Gotta find a $50 somewhere, I gotta tie my shoes and slick my hair. Gotta get myself a boutonniere, 'cause Lulu's back in town. You can tell all his pets,
all my pets,
all his blondes and brunettes.
Oh yeah,
Mr. Tyler regrets.
No,
he won't be around. And you can tell the mailman not to call, 'cause I ain't coming home until the fall, and I might not get back home at all. Lulu's back in town.
oh yeah, Franny.
Franny's back in town.
How about Bobby?
Bobby's back in town.
Johnny.
Johnny's back in town.
Megan.
Megan's back in town.
How about all of us?